The variety of pathogens a drug acts against is defined as the drug's spectrum of action. And we can kind of classify that as some drugs have a narrow spectrum of action and some drugs have a broader spectrum of action. A broader spectrum of action works against a lot of different types of pathogens and microorganisms. A narrow spectrum is going to be much more restrictive on what it works against. So let me ask you, which one is better? Would you prefer to be prescribed a broad spectrum antibiotic or a narrow spectrum antibiotic? Pros and cons, what they'll be. I think I'll give you time to think for a second. All right, so let me give you a story and then let's see what you guys think after the story. So let's say you're a clinician and a patient comes in to the clinic and they are experiencing symptoms such as painful urination, maybe blood in the urine, frequency, they urge to urinate frequently. You take a urine sample, it's cloudy. Immediately you understand that this patient has a urinary tract infection. There's some sort of infection going on. So you can either prescribe a broad spectrum antibiotic or a narrow spectrum antibiotic. Let's do broad spectrum first. So let's do a broad spectrum antibiotic. Prescribe that to the patient. They go home, they start taking the antibiotic. The antibiotic works against a lot of different types of bacteria. We don't know what type of bacteria this patient in particular has, but it works against a broad variety of bacteria. And they start to feel better. You make a follow-up call after 24, 48 hours, and the patient's like, yeah, symptoms have resolved, I'm feeling better. That's great. So, broad spectrum antibiotic. However, another 24 to 48 hours passes. The patient calls back into your office, or maybe comes back in, probably just calls, and says, hey, I was getting better, but now I'm experiencing some different symptoms. It's itchy in the vaginal region. I'm getting a smelly discharge, maybe a white discharge. What's going on now? Well, your broad spectrum antibiotic wiped out not only the bacteria causing the issue, the urinary tract infection, but it wiped out the good bacteria in that region as well and allowed an overgrowth of yeast. You now have a patient with a yeast infection. This is a secondary infection. It's iatrogenic. It is a direct result of our interactions and our prescribing that broad spectrum antibiotic. You know what to do. So you prescribe medicine that gets rid of a yeast infection. The patient takes that and everything goes on. All right, so that was a broad spectrum antibiotic. Was that the best choice? Let's rewind and do this scenario with a narrow spectrum antibiotic. This time patient comes in, they've got the symptoms, you diagnose a urinary tract infection. This time you're going to send it off to the lab. You're going to figure out, I'm going to know what this bacteria is so that I can prescribe a narrow spectrum antibiotic. It's more effective just against that bacteria. And then that way you won't have to deal with a secondary infection. So you tell the patient what you're going to do. You're going to send this off to the lab. You send the patient home. However, patient is not happy. Patient is still experiencing symptoms of this urinary tract infection. It didn't get better. You're waiting on lab results. Lab results are going to take some time, 24 hours if you're lucky, 48 hours before you know. Meanwhile, your patient is still experiencing the initial symptoms, and you get a call 48 hours later while you're waiting for lab results that your patient is now in the ER. Their symptoms progressed up into their lower back issue, became very painful, and now they have a kidney infection. That initial urinary tract infection moved up into the bladder and into the kidneys, and now they have a kidney infection, which is much more severe, harder to treat, and so on. So, which is better, broad spectrum or narrow spectrum? There are pros and cons with both, and you need to weigh the risks. Typically, what's done now for this type of thing is a broad spectrum antibiotic. And then if the secondary yeast infection happens, you can treat that then. So you have to take into account those types of information as you're going through. Okay. Again, not one right answer. There is a recommended plan of action when you're weighing all the pros and cons, and then each patient has to make, or each doctor has to make a decision based on their particular patient as what is right for them. Okay, so which one's better? Narrow, we said it takes time and testing to determine what that is, and you may have a more severe infection that develops while you're waiting. Broad can cause a secondary infection. The other thing about hitting it with a broad spectrum antibiotic is that we get rid of a lot of different things. As we know, any bacteria that is resistant to that broad spectrum antibiotic can also grow. So anytime we treat with a broad spectrum antibiotic, we are running the risk of allowing resistant bacteria to be able to grow and take hold of that. This can lead to that issue where we have of drug resistant bacteria that are no longer susceptible to the drugs that we have. So that can be an issue. When we're dealing with that broad spectrum antibiotic, our normal microbiome is taking up space. This is back to that concept of microbial antagonism, and that's when our normal microbiome protects us against pathogens just by taking up space, using nutrients, and that kind of thing. So a broad spectrum antibiotic will reduce our microbial antagonism and allow yeast to grow. All right, this is just a chart that kind of shows you the different types of drugs that we've kind of talked about a little bit and where they work. You don't need to memorize any on this, but if you'll notice, there's a big line that not a lot of drugs can cross. Drugs that work against prokaryotes versus drug that works against eukaryotes. And you can see it's very difficult to have a drug that crosses that. Again, a lot of differences between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. We talked about eukaryotic cells are much more, or drugs that fight eukaryotic pathogens are harder to develop because we also have eukaryotic cells. You can see that there's less on that, and there's a lot of chances for side effects. Selective toxicity is reduced. It's hard to get something that's toxic to the eukaryotic pathogen, the fungus, the worms, without being toxic to the host. Viruses, you also see there's another line here. Drugs that work against viruses, very different in action, and they don't work against drugs that are bacterial or other things. You can see some broad spectrums, you can see some narrow spectrums as you go through.